Now, on the subject of dirty tricks, on the subject of dictatorship, I want to ask a relevant follow-on question. Obviously, the last two and a half weeks have been dominated by the revelations that have come from Edward Snowden, other whistleblowers, what's been published in The Guardian, what's been published in The Washington Post. And every step along the way, Obama and his compatriots have tried to deny what has been exposed, only to be exposed once again as being liars every step along the way. Now, what this surveillance operation is, really in its essence, is nothing but a national and international system of blackmail that would make J. Edgar Hoover's operation pale in comparison. There's several indications of this that I can point out. First, as was exposed last week, going all the way back to the G20 summit in London in 2009, the NSA was working together with the British NSA, the GCHQ, to wiretap and monitor the communications of every single head of state and their entire retinue that came along with them to that London G20 summit. Now, this was exposed in leaks from Edward Snowden, and it was exposed that their computers, their phone calls were all being monitored on the instructions of the British government, of David Cameron and others. Some delegates were even tricked into using fake internet cafes that had been set up by the British host intelligence services to read their email traffic. Dmitry Medvedev, the then president of Russia, was one of the number one heads of state to be targeted for this surveillance. Now, what's fascinating is to realize that this entire surveillance operation in the G20 summit in 2009 was intended as a way to bludgeon these leaders into passing the bailout and, as we know now, the bail-in, to make that the agenda in response to the 2007-2008 crisis, as opposed to what should have been enacted all the way back then, which was Glass-Steagall. This was indicated in a FOTSET column at the beginning of this week, describing exactly how Gordon Brown asked the British intelligence services to do this operation in order to make sure that he had a leg up to push through his bailout agenda. And in fact, it's written right into the British Intelligence Services Act in Section 1 that their intelligence services have a mandate to operate not only in the interests of national security, but also in the interests of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom. So you have that. You also have the questions domestically that Senator Kirk asked Eric Holder when he first appeared to testify on this NSA wiretapping. Senator Kirk put Holder on the spot and said, "Tell me this, did you ever monitor the telephone communications of sitting members of the U.S. Congress?" And Holder sort of issued a non-denial denial. And Kirk hit him on that and said, look, the right answer would have been absolutely not. That would be against the Constitution and the separation of powers. Now, this has been confirmed. Senator Kirk's suspicions have been confirmed just this week in an interview that was conducted with Russell Tice, who's a very credible and well-known source because he was the source of the original 2005 leaks to the to the New York Times exposing the original Bush warrantless wiretapping program. He's former Air Force intelligence and former NSA. Now, what Russell Tice said was really explosive. This is an interview. He said, I had my hands, when I worked at the NSA, literally on the paperwork for these sorts of things. They went after high-ranking military officers. They went after members of Congress, both the Senate and the House, especially on the intelligence committees, the armed services committees, and the judiciary committees. They went after lawyers and law firms. They went after judges, including one of which is now sitting on the Supreme Court. He said, I had his wiretap information in my hand. He said 2 of them are former FISA court judges. They went after State Department officials. They went after people in the executive service that were part of the White House, their own people. They went after anti-war groups. They went after U.S. companies that do international business. They went after U.S. banking firms that do international business. They went after NGOs like the Red Cross, who go overseas and do humanitarian work. They went after anti-war civil rights groups. So don't tell me that there's no abuse, because I've had this stuff in my hand and I've looked at it. So this report obviously confirms not only what Senator Kirk's suspicions were, but also other reports that we've received from insiders on Capitol Hill along similar lines. And the interviewer correctly pointed out at this point in the interview, this creates the basis and the potential for massive blackmail. And then Russell Tice drops the big bomb. He says, absolutely. And here's the big one. This was in the summer of 2004. One of the papers I held in my hand was a wiretap of a bunch of numbers associated with a 40-something-year-old wannabe senator from Illinois. You wouldn't happen to know where that guy lives right now, would you? It's a big white house in Washington, D.C. That's who they went after, and that's the President of the United States now. So this, as I said, goes deeper than J. Edgar Hoover ever could have dreamed. This is the control apparatus of the British Empire globally and within the United States. And I think that this corresponds directly with the reason why many members of Congress might be a little skittish to stand up courageously to J.P. Morgan and this crowd in the fight for Glass-Steagall. So maybe your comments on this.
Well, I think it goes a little deeper than that. I mean, I know, for example, that these considerations are there. But I also know that we have a long-standing record of gutlessness among leading officials, elected and others of our nation. I've seen it all the way through. I've been the target of it, and I've also been a target of targeting it at the same time. And this goes back essentially, I would say, well, back to 1971, about that time as I began to play the game against this sort of crap. So this is not new to me at all. And what I've seen is well, look, take the case of Bush. Now, the original Bush in this connection was actually funded Adolf Hitler's promotion in Germany. And more than that, the whole crowd, including leading figures in Britain, were guilty of cahoots with Hitler. Now what happened, there was a change where things weren't working out too well, and so they came up with a different solution, the Churchill solution. And Churchill begged for, Franklin Roosevelt to save the British Union. But also at the same time, what was done as we began to win the war, what happened is the British monarchy did everything possible to prevent President Franklin Roosevelt from proceeding with what he could have accomplished, that is to move in on France, on the south of France and north of France, and lead in to just crack the whole Nazi thing at the point it was ready to be cracked. That was postponed until the point that Roosevelt died. And only after Roosevelt died did the British monarchy allow the victory over Hitler. And this is what the Bush family represents. The Bush family has been part of this process all the way through. That's only an example. I mean, Cheney is Cheney. Huh? One of the worst. Young Bush, one of the dumbest, but also nasty. And then we got this other thing, Obama, who's a complete stooge. So what's happened is you had a defeat after defeat since the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers. Defeat after defeat of the United States from people inside the United States who were in cahoots with this British crowd. And the Bush family is one of the worst. The Bush family has a Hitler pedigree. It's well known. How many times was Bush either vice president, either a vice president or a president? And look at the record of what they did as those presidents. Look at the change. Now you had also Bush was a vice president at a crucial point on the question of the SDI. And Bush, though he's not such a smart guy, he never was, but he's a Bush of this crowd. And that was another factor. Many of the problems I had with in that period, in the 1980s, was entirely a matter of Bush. It was a Bush operation. And even the president himself at that time was unable to control that situation. So what's the sum up of this? The United States has been the victim of the British Empire repeatedly, and repeatedly. The Anglo-Dutch Empire, which was established in that period. And we never really beat it. We did beat them back again and again. But you have to take the number of presidents who were assassinated under British orders. Lincoln is only one example of this. John Kennedy, was a victim of this. And now, even now, they pretend to not to treat it so seriously anymore. But it was afraid of it. It was a murder of a president. And they murdered the brother who was going to run for president at that same time. And from that point on, at the exact break point, we were drawn into a war which was totally unnecessary, the Indochina War. And we had Douglas MacArthur, the greatest general the United States ever had, frankly, in terms of skill, said, don't do it. And the only way they got the United States to go to the war in Indochina was by killing John F. Kennedy as president. And there were a lot of people in important places, including, say, from California, a governor from California, who played a key part in this. So you had an assassination of a president, John F. Kennedy, in order to get us into a war, which the best advisor on military affairs said no. The president said no, so they killed the president. So the problem is this nation of ours has been the target of the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, for all of this time. And there have been many incidents that have occurred in this process. And when you talk about the weakness of members of the Congress, weakness of members of other officials, and so forth, you have to understand one thing. A lot of presidents have been killed, always by the British. And you have in the United States the Wall Street gang, which was all a treasonous crowd from the beginning. British bankers controlled the United States from on. So that's where we stand. The question is, we've come to a time where the situation is so bad that the usual cowardice and cringing cowardice of our leading officials, out of cowardice, their career depends upon being a coward. It depends on this kind of thing. The time has come where we have to get our guts together and do very simple things. In this case, the mere passage of Glass-Steagall, if it's passed with understanding of what it really means, the Hamiltonian principle, then we can get our country back. Now, on the other hand, if we don't do this, what is looking at us now is not an Indochina war, it's a thermonuclear war. And everyone, including like General Dempsey and so forth, are talking about preventing the United States from being dragged in very soon into a thermonuclear war. Now, a thermonuclear war means that from beginning to end, about an hour and a half, The extinction of the human species has virtually occurred. You cannot have a nuclear war, to be a thermonuclear war now. You cannot have such a war. What does it mean if you're going to take on China and Russia? What does that mean? Are they going to surrender simply because you've got nuclear weapons? Absolutely not. 1.2 or more billion Chinese are not going to cave in that easily. Not when they have the weapons they have. Russia will not cave in. Other nations will not cave in. So if we're going to have a nation, if we're going to have a world perhaps to live in, what we need right now is nothing as much as a reenactment immediately of Glass-Steagall.